Emirati Foreign Minister Abdullah bin Zayed Al Nahyan met in Damascus with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, we are concerned by reports of this meeting and the signal it sends. As we've said before, this administration will not express any support for efforts to normalize or to rehabilitate Bashar al-Assad, who is a brutal dictator. We urge states in the region to carefully consider the atrocities that this regime, that Bashar al-Assad himself, has perpetrated on the Syrian people over the last decade, as well as the regime's ongoing efforts to deny much of the country access to humanitarian aid and security. This is an issue that we often do have opportunity to discuss with our close partners in the region, including with our Emirati partners, and we've made very clear where we stand on this.
So are you at odds with them? Because this seems to be the track most Arab countries are taking. Egypt, is doing the same thing, reaching out and so on. Saudi Arabia, probably behind the scenes, are doing it. Kuwait, most of your allies in the region are headed in that direction, maybe with the exception of Qatar.
As I often do, I will leave it to our partners, I will leave it to our allies to characterize their position on Syria, their position on the Assad regime. When it comes to our position on the Assad regime, look, we will not normalize or upgrade our diplomatic relations with the Assad regime, nor do we support other countries normalizing or upgrading their relations, given the atrocities that this regime has inflicted on its own people, on the Syrian people. We believe, and this I am confident that we share with many of our partners, that stability in Syria and the greater region can only be achieved through a political process that represents the will of all Syrians. And we're committed to working with allies, we're committed to working with partners and the UN toward the achievement of a durable political solution.
So if your allies decide that getting Syria back into the Arab fold is in their interest, you're not going to take them to the woodshed, are you? I mean, are you going to be at odds with them and express that? And perhaps, I don't know what action you would take to dissuade them from doing that, but it seems
we will do whatever is most productive towards this cause of a political settlement. Look, when it comes to Syria, we have focused on several objectives, and we have done so in close cooperation and coordination with our partners. One is expanding humanitarian access. That is of the utmost priority to us. It is also something that the Assad regime has sought to counteract and to limit at every turn. We've sought to sustain the U.S. and the coalition effort against ISIS, against al-Qaeda and terrorist groups in Syria. We have signaled our collective demand for accountability from the Assad regime and for the preservation of international norms, such as the promotion of human rights and non-proliferation, including through the imposition of targeted sanctions. And we have sought to sustain the local ceasefires in place across the country. So we're continuing to assess how best to advance the prospects for a political settlement as outlined in UN Security Council Resolution 2254, and we'll continue to consult closely with our allies and partners, knowing that they too have a very important role as we seek to bring this about.
Latest news, Syria. Qatar has no plan to normalize ties with Syria. U.S. claims 2019 airstrike that hit Syrian women and children was justified. This is the latest news. Al Jazeera headliner. Qatar has no plan to normalize ties with Syria, dated November 12, 2021. Qatar is not considering normalizing ties with Syria and hopes other countries will be discouraged from taking further steps with President Bashar al-Assad's government. Foreign Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman al-Thani has said his comments at a joint news conference with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Washington were in response to a question on a visit this week by the foreign minister of fellow Gulf state, the United Arab Emirates, to Damascus. Al-Thani said on Friday, "It will be wishful thinking to have all the countries in the region united when it comes to the issue of Syria. We hope that countries will be discouraged from taking further steps with the Syrian regime in order not to worsen the misery of the Syrian people." He also went on to add, We don't see any serious steps by the Assad regime showing his commitment to repair the damage that he made for his own country and people. Qatar was among several regional states, including Saudi Arabia, that backed rebels in Syria's decades-old war. Some, like the United Arab Emirates, have sought to normalize ties after Assad regained control of most of the country. UAE earlier this year called for Syria to be remitted to the Arab League. On Tuesday, Foreign Minister Sheikh Abdul bin Zayed met with Assad in Damascus in his first such visit by a senior Emirati dignitary since the civil war erupted. Washington, which opposes the efforts to normalize ties with Assad until progress is made toward a political solution to the conflict, said it was concerned about the move by the UAE, one of its allies. At Friday's press conference, Blinken said the U.S. is concerned about the signals that some of these visits and engagements are sending. He went on to say, I would simply urge all of our partners to remember the crimes that the Assad regime has committed and indeed continues to commit. We don't support normalization. Last month, the Emirati Economy Ministry said it had agreed with the Syrian counterpart to enhance trade and economic cooperation. Ties between the two countries have slowly rekindled since the UAE reopened its embassy in Damascus in late 2018. March 2019, bin Zayed said the UAE intended to ensure the Syrian returns to the Arab region. Last month, al-Assad held a phone call with Jordan's King Abdullah II. The conversation was preceded by the full reopening of the main border crossing between the two countries in September. Guardian headliner, U.S. claims 2019 airstrike that hit Syrian women and children was justified. November 14, 2021. The U.S. military has confirmed for the first time a 2019 airstrike in Syria that killed up to 80 people, mostly women and children, but claimed the strike was justified as it killed Islamic State fighters who were attacking coalition forces. Confirmation from U.S. Central Command followed a report by the New York Times in which former and current Pentagon officials alleged there had been a cover-up of a likely war crime. Central Command argued that because some women and children had taken up arms for the Islamic State, whether by indoctrination or choice, they could not strictly be classified as civilians. Strike was carried out on March 18, 2019 in the town of Baghuz on the Euphrates River, which forms the Syrian-Iraqi border, where Syrian Democratic Forces, with U.S. air support, were besieging the last organized remnants of ISIS in Syria. The Times reports that 2 bombs were dropped on a crowd of women and children trying to escape the fighting on the banks of the Euphrates, whereby identified as civilians, but a U.S. drone strike operated from Qatar. It said the drone operators in al-Assad air base were stunned when they first saw the 500-pound bomb dropped by a U.S. F-15E plane, and then a second 2,000-pound bomb dropped on the survivors. Who dropped that? One analyst asks on a chat system used by those monitoring the drone footage, according to the report. Within minutes, a legal officer flagged a possible war crime that required investigation and ordered the drone footage and other embedded evidence. The initial battle damage assessment put the death toll at 70, but no independent inquiry was ever carried out. The Air Force lawyer, Lieutenant Colonel Dean Corsack, took the case to the Pentagon Inspector General, but the subsequent report was stripped of any mention of the strike. Corsack subsequently sent details of the incident to the Senate Armed Services Committee, in which he said, I'm putting myself at great risk of military retaliation for sending this. Senior ranking U.S. military officials intentionally and systematically circumvented the deliberate strike process. Gene Tate, a civilian analyst in the Inspector General's office who complained about the lack of action, was forced out of his job. The New York Times investigation found that the airstrike at Baghuz was called in by a shadowy U.S. Special Forces unit known as Task Force 9, operating independently from the Operations Center in Qatar, and which appears to have sidestepped the procedures put in place to minimize civilian casualties. U.S. Central Command said the context for the airstrikes was a desperate last stand by ISIS, referred to by the alternative acronym Islamic State and Levant, ISIL. The ISIS pocket included thousands of fighters and family members, including women and children, said Captain Bill Urban, the Central Command spokesman. The remaining fighters included some women and children combatants, along with many ISIS family members, including some who were likely held against their will, decided to make a determined stand in an area that included buildings, tunnels, and cliffs. Multiple entreaties to ISIS to allow family members to depart the area were rebuffed. Thousands of family members remained in the area fighting. Urban said that on the morning of March 18th, IS fighters launched a counterattack on Syrian democratic positions that lasted several hours, during which an SDF position was in danger of being overrun. Special forces called in an airstrike. He said they were unaware that a drone with a high-definition video footage was in the area and relied on a standard definition feed from another drone. According to the Central Command account, drones over Baghuz had used all their Hellfire missiles, so the air support available came from F-15s, who dropped 3 bombs. The bombs killed at least 16 Islamic State fighters, according to the U.S. military assessment. It also confirmed 4 civilian deaths. Urban went on to say, the investigations were unable to conclusively characterize the status of more than 60 other casualties that resulted from these strikes. The reason for this uncertainty is that multiple armed women and at least one armed child were observed in the video, and the exact mixture of armed and unarmed personnel could not be conclusively determined. Likely, a majority of those killed were also combatants at the time of the strike. However, it is also highly likely that these were additional civilians killed by these 2 strikes. An investigation ordered by Special Forces commanders found the strike was justified as self-defense and proportional due to the unavailability of smaller ordnance at the time of the request. As a consequence, however, procedures were changed to require high-definition video surveillance before such strikes are ordered, that the strike cell on the ground should coordinate with any coalition aircraft. Urban went on to say, we abhor the loss of innocent life and take all possible measures to prevent them. That's the latest news. Now my thoughts. What a joke. What a joke. You know, that last statement really tells you the hypocrisy of the military, especially at the U.S. Central Command. God's sakes. I mean, yeah, not everybody in the military is a damn murderer, but for goodness sakes, you know, when you basically say, yeah, we abhor the loss of innocent life and take all possible measures to prevent them, well, you should have gotten intelligence, or you could have went down there on the ground with boots on the ground and ascertained intelligence about how many women and children were there and how many Islamic State fighters were there. Instead, you just ascertained intelligence based on SDF forces who basically want to kill everybody possible. When you conduct strikes like this, you basically create more terrorists. You're killing whole families. And, you know, for the men that survive this and see their wives and children dead, entire families wiped out, you basically have created the war on terror to continue. You facilitated it. And this is exactly why the war on terror is a joke. In the same fashion, the war on drugs is a joke when you have an intelligence service like the CIA who continue to facilitate it by importing drugs from countries in South America and Central America. I mean, this is just, you know, asinine to think that the Pentagon doesn't apologize for the war crimes it commits. Give you an example. Just recently, the Pentagon admits to a tragic mistake that killed 10 civilians. And we're talking about the civilian strike, which came from a drone in August 29th in Kabul, that said, oh, we killed ISIS, an imminent ISIS Khorasan threat. Meanwhile, it was 10 civilians. 7 of them were children. And who gave the report on that? Well, it was the United States Central Command head, General Frank McKenzie, who told reporters at the Pentagon, quote, I am now convinced that as many as 10 civilians, up to 7 children, were tragically killed in the strike. Moreover, we analyze it as unlikely that the vehicles and those who died were associated with ISIS Khorasan or a direct threat to U.S. forces. He ended it with, our investigation now concludes that the strike was a tragic mistake, not a crime, by the way. That would be considered a war crime. Now, if the United States were a part of the Rome Statutes, which is The Hague, the International Criminal Courts, this would be considered a war crime, and the United States would be held liable. Now you know why the United States is not a co-signer to the Rome Statutes. And neither is Israel, neither is Iraq or North Korea, and 3 other countries. It's not like these people, and this is a much egregious crime. They're stating that 16 of these 70 people were ISIS fighters, not knowing the details of whether they were or not definitively. They just assumed that fact. Now, many of these people are unwilling slaves. Some of them are, most of the women that are with ISIS are unwitting sex slaves. Slaves in the open market. Need I remind you that there's a slave open market in Libya, and that was facilitated by the United States. Thank you, Hillary Clinton, Samantha Rice. These people should be held for war crimes. Bush, Trump, Obama, the United States is guilty. And to say that it's not our fault that these civilians, and they consider them civilians, were a part of ISIS. Well, maybe they had no choice. But don't spit in the faces of the American people and say we take all possible measures to prevent the killing of innocent life. You don't. That's the reason why you use drone strikes, so you won't have to look at the person's face as you're killing them. And kill them you shall. In regards to Qatar, against the normalization of relations with Syria, well, that's not shocking, considering that Qatar, in a earlier report, basically sent hundreds of millions of dollars to a group like al-Nusra Front in Syria. And that was a report in summer of 2021. And that's coming from actually the claim comes from 9 Syrians who lodged a claim for damages against 2 Qatari banks, charities, businesses, and politicians, alleging that a private office of the Gulf state's monarch was central to a system of illegal money transfers to the al-Qaeda affiliate. And the defendants included Hamad bin Jassim al-Thani, the Qatari's former prime minister, and Abdullah Manra al-Hajari, who owns the Rats Hotel in London. The claim was lodged in the commercial division of the UK's High Court and reportedly alleges that the conspiracy includes a Muslim Brotherhood, secretive meetings in Turkey, and money laundering via bloated construction contracts and property prices, as well as overpayments to migrant workers from Syria. And it's no surprise the United States, of course, through Secretary Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State, basically repeats the narrative that we shouldn't deal with Bashar al-Assad's corrupt regime. It wasn't Assad who used a covert operation called Timber Sycamore to train and fund militants to help overthrow his government, right? That was the United States through the CIA, authorized by then President Barack Obama, which was approved by then Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and of course, King Abdullah II of Jordan, who, by the way, wants to normalize relations because now he can see that the Syrian government, backed by Iran, Lebanon, Hezbollah, Iranian proxy forces fighting against the ghoulish CIA-funded Syrian jihadists like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Jabhat al-Nusra, and whatever damn group they have over there now. You can't beat them, join them. 10 years ago, King Abdullah was basically calling and approving for militants to help overthrow Assad. Well, 10 years later, he's still there. The corrupt nature of this country's government. I mean, there is no corrupt, no more nefariously corrupt, immoral government than the United States. And this is proof of it. And the hypocrisy can only go so far. And what we need are more people to speak out against it.